What's going on? Today I wanted to do a thorough walkthrough of our multifamily underwriting tool and really just kind of go through line by line so that A, when you underwrite properties, you can make sure you're not missing anything, and B, if you're analyzing a deal that you're looking to invest in, you can also kind of just get a better understanding of the underwriting. So kind of working from top to bottom here, we have our annual rent escalator and annual expense escalator. And so obviously if you kind of look one or two lines lower, you've got your average monthly rent. And you're increasing your average monthly rent by a percentage, just like you're increasing your expenses to kind of keep up with inflation or just natural rent growth or forced rent growth, whether you're renovating the property or just it's in an area where rents seem to kind of uptick over time. One thing to keep in mind is that let's say you've got these equaled out, so your expense ratio isn't changing once you're stabilized. Let's say we move these to a 4% and a 4% from the 2%. You can kind of see here, let's say you plan to exit year 5 and your net operating income at a 4% escalator is just over $760,000. And if we move it back to 2%, $684,000. So a pretty significant difference just by your acceleration of rent growth, even though the expense ratio is staying the same for the hold period. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, Fed's target inflation rate is 2%. If you err towards the more conservative side, the lower end, say 2% and 4% happens, obviously you can see that even if your expenses also increase at 4%, your NOI growth is significantly larger. To move on from there, physical vacancy. So this is the amount of units that are actually vacant. So this is a 100-unit property, 5% vacancy. Obviously that's 5 units vacant, 6% vacancy, that's 6 unit vacant. So that's again the units that are actually vacant through the year. Economic vacancy is concessions. So maybe you've got several units vacant and you offer first month's rent free. That would be a concession. Loss to lease is the discrepancy between market rent and what you're charging. So if you're charging $950 and market rent is $1,000, there's a loss to lease. And then bad debt, so tenants that don't actually pay. So that gets your total vacancy here. Depending on the market, stabilization can be anywhere from 6 to even 12% is as high as we've underwritten in some more rural markets where we do expect it to be harder to turn vacant units and fill those vacant units. Obviously, this comes down to the effective gross income. And from here, we have RUBS and other income. RUBS is a ratio utility billing system. So basically, if you have a property for, say, water, sewer is on the landlord and you don't have sub-metered units, but you want to pass or offset your expense back onto the tenants, you can use that ratio system to either charge a fee back to the tenants based on usage or how many tenants are in each unit or things like that. So that's what that kind of other income piece for the RUBS is. And then other income, this could be maintenance bill backs if you have internet on site that tenants can pay for, if you have maybe laundry, or if it's in a busier area and you charge for parking, things like that. Those are going to fall under other income. So now we get into really the meat of the expenses. So real estate taxes is obviously typically a very large expense, especially for multifamily properties. And this is something that, depending on the municipality and county, can be reassessed at the purchase price that you're buying the property for, or maybe it's already just kind of reassessed on a market value basis every couple of years. It really depends. So that's something worth researching. We found that a lot of county auditor websites will actually have a tool to help you estimate what the taxes are going to be based on the new purchase price. This specifically comes into play more with properties that maybe the sellers owned it for 25 years and taxes just seem really low. They bought it, far less than what you're buying it for. And so definitely worth digging into that and estimating what your tax or potential tax increase might be. Insurance is another big one. We've seen a lot of properties recently, obviously 2023, early 2023 right now. Insurance costs have certainly increased. And so we've seen, properties that are currently insured for, say, $250 a unit. And our insurance cost in Ohio right now is closer to $450 a unit. So definitely something that it's worth getting a quote on and not just plugging in $300 a unit. So keep that in mind and, don't be afraid to get a quote from your broker. Contract services, this can really be kind of a a number of things. If you have, let's say, maybe some common area space and you have a cleaning company come in once a week, or maybe you have a gym on site, it's a larger complex, and you've got someone coming in, cleaning the gym, things like that is typically where we, see the contract services. So for smaller properties, you likely have another line item that covers it, because grounds management and trash removal could also fall under contract services, but we do have those broken out here. Moving on to trash removal, let's say we have maybe dumpsters on site, or we've got a trash service. That's obviously going to be that fee there. Pretty self-explanatory. Electric, to kind of keep in mind here, let's say you have common areas or interior access to the building or exterior lighting, or maybe you have some lampposts in your complex. Obviously, those electric expenses are going to fall on you, as well as vacant units. You've got some turns to do. The utilities will be transferred back into your name during that period. So that's where the electric expense is most typically going to come from. Gas, depending on if you have on-site laundry, that's something where maybe you have some gas hot water heaters. That's going to be an expense there, as well as vacant units, especially in the wintertime. If you need to leave the heat on, that's where that expense is going to come into play. Water, sewer, obviously pretty self-explanatory as well. But one thing to keep in mind is, especially on value add properties, maybe you're buying a property with, let's say, a 25% vacancy. So the property is only 75% occupied. That means that once you infill, those vacant units, realistically, your utility, your water sewer expense could increase if it's on you by, say 25 of those 25 units. So, for round numbers, if it was 50,000, it could go up by, $15,000 to $20,000. Legal, again, heavy value adds, we like to underwrite that, hey, we're probably going to have some evictions to deal with if the property's in poor condition, units are in poor condition, tenants not paying. So that is definitely an expense that we typically factor for a little bit heavier on the upfront takeover, and then phase that to a couple $1,000s a year, depending on the size of the property stabilized. Moving on to a management fee. So depending on the size of the property, there's kind of two different standards in the industry. There's a percent of gross monthly collected rents. And then for even larger complexes with on-site leasing agents or management, there's typically a smaller fee. So maybe 3%, and then a pass-through payroll bill. So most of the properties that we're looking at fall under the 100-unit range, and we don't have on-site leasing agents or maintenance techs or things like that. So typically we're just paying the management company a 8 to 12% monthly fee. And again, that's the percent on collected monthly revenue. Repairs and maintenance and turns, definitely depending on the age and condition of the property, this can vary. We've seen others underwrite and kind of be able to stick to $500 for repairs and maintenance and turns per unit per year. On the higher end, $750, $800 for some of those older properties where we know there's going to be a little bit more intensivity of maintenance and taking care of items, especially 60s, 70s builds. Just plumbing starts to go, you're constantly updating valves, leaks under the sink, plumbing, things like that. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at older properties. But typically, again, the range we see is $500 to $800 a unit per year. General and admin, again, this definitely comes more into play with larger properties and having the on-site staff. Let's get this switched over quick. So, if you have an office on site and you need to pay for Wi-Fi and office supplies, maybe a phone, computer, things like that, that's really where we see that come into play. So for most of our properties, our general and admin isn't a very large expense. Payroll, we already kind of touched on. Let's say for this property specifically is a 100-unit complex, and we've got a full-time leasing agent. So the management fee might be 3%, and then they pass through a payroll expense to us of the on-site leasing agent of $45,000 a year, something like that. So that's typically where that's going to come into play. Advertising. So let's say you're going to run Facebook or Google ads when your units are turned and you're ready to try and lease them up. You're going to maybe run some ads, or you're going to pay for the apartments.com subscription, or you're going to pay for third-party listing services. Things like that is where kind of your advertising costs are going to come into account. Grounds management is going to be your landscaping. So maybe you've got someone coming on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis, cutting the grass, weed whacking, and maybe doing some landscaping around the buildings a couple times a year. That's going to be that expense there. And one thing that's not on here, but again, older properties or value add properties where maybe you're taking a C- asset to a B- or C+, we're likely going to have some pest fees and extermination fees, things like that. We've had to deal with bed bugs before. We've had to deal with field mice getting into basements, things like that. can definitely come up. So take those into account as well. From there, things that fall below the line. So below the line essentially means everything we've talked about up until this point gets calculated into the total expenses, which gets subtracted from, again, your net income, and that determines your net operating income. From there, CapEx reserves. Typically, this is a reserve account taking into account roofs, driveways, mechanicals, things that aren't going to need to be done on a regular recurring basis, but more of those one-off items that maybe you do, roofs are good for 25 plus years at this point. So that's what the CapEx reserves are going to be. From there, syndicator accounting. If you are doing a syndication for one of these larger properties, that also falls below the line. Obviously, to meet the SEC guidelines and efficiently distribute funds to your investors, and the tracking that goes into account there with the accounting software, that's going to be an expense that you want to make sure you're taking into account, but not subtracting out of your net operating income. So hopefully this was somewhat insightful to kind of go through components that we look for, expenses, and maybe you've underwritten properties and we're missing one or two of these things, and hopefully this was eye-opening to that, and you're not hopefully missing out on those things in the future.